Welcome to the Kaleidoscope of Possibilities, Alternative Perspectives on Mental Health. My name is Dr. Adriana Popescu. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and leader in the field of mental health, energy psychology, addiction, trauma, and empowerment. In this podcast, we will be exploring mental health from a variety of perspectives, from the spiritual to the shamanic and beyond. What if mental illness isn't everything we think it is? What if everything we see as a pathology is actually a possibility? What else is possible with mental health? Hi, everyone. Dr. Adriana Popescu here with you today with another episode of Kaleidoscope of Possibilities, Alternative Perspectives on Mental Health. I'm really excited today to have with me somebody I've known for a very long time. His name is Ben Eiland, and he has been in the chemical dependency treatment and mental health field for over 45 years, with 48 years in his own personal recovery. He graduated from Cal State Chico with a double major in anthropology and psychology, finished the coursework in a master's in public administration, and received a master's in organizational psychology from JFK University. He's been an educator in the field of addictive disorders since 1979, holding positions as adjunct professor at College of San Mateo Addiction Study Program for the last 22 years, and he's the coordinator and instructor for Cal State East Bay Addiction Studies Program. Ben's also held positions as executive director, program manager, and clinical director, as well as being a counselor in a number of substance abuse treatment programs in the Bay Area, which is how we met. And his approach to the treatment of substance abuse disorders has been in the biopsychosocial and spiritual recovery. He considers himself a seeker, and through that seeking has explored a variety of ways for a person to find spiritual recovery and fill the hole in their soul that addiction and trauma left. After all these years, he's still passionate about working with addictive disorders and educating those who choose to follow this path. Thank you, Ben, for being here. Welcome.
Thank you. That was listening to that was just saying, gee, I've done a whole bunch of stuff over the years.
Yes, you have.
In terms of the ideas that I put forth there, my personal life, my story, it's not very exciting in terms of what we call about alcoholism. There was no big, huge thing. I came from a very nice alcoholic family. There was, no abuse directly. I mean, there was, if we want to get into the psychobabble, there was emotional abandonment and etc. I think we've talked a little bit about the Enneagram and my typical Enneagram number 7. Figured out that I wasn't going to get my needs met by my family, so I better figure them out for myself. And and I was one of those, what they call an early onset alcoholic. First time I took a drink, I drank like a drunk till the last time I drank. I have no clue of what a social drink really means because the craving for it started right from the beginning. So in terms of, the recovery thing, I had tried a variety of things. I actually had been in a couple of psychiatric hospitals and no one would accept me for being an alcoholic back in those days. This is back in the 70s because I was so young and you had to be on Skid Row kind of thing. So, I tried a variety of things, to quit drinking and I finally, sort of wandered into AA. It was the last thing I wanted to do. Back in those days, God spelled backwards was dog, and that's all I wanted to know about it. And of course, 12-step. If we peel away a lot of the stuff, the bottom line to 12-step is basically a spiritual journey. You have to have some belief in. And there's all kinds of issues around 12-step and how the big book was written and all that sort of stuff. And I'm not a real big book person, but for me, the bottom line was not about psychology or or the biochemistry. I believe there's a biochemistry to some alcoholics, mine in specific, but it was really about the spiritual journey. So once I was willing to accept that, then that put me on a path. I've read everything from astrology to Zoroastrianism, and in terms of that path. And I've done a lot of work in Buddhism, especially something called Bon Buddhism, which is more of the has more of a sort of a shamanic bent to it. And but the bottom line is I settled on what a lot of people call the Red Road and Native American spirituality, and I've been involved with that for a long time. And so in my work, we talk about the biopsychosocial. Well, how much is biological, this idea of the disease, the physical allergy to alcohol and drugs, and then the psychology, the issue around, which is probably the biggest one that's coming up, is levels of trauma that a person has experienced. And then the sociology, the environment you come from, and what supports or doesn't support your recovery. And then this issue of spirituality. And I talk about the spirituality is an issue around the hole in the soul, that the metaphor I use is that everyone's born with just a little hole in their soul, and you can fill it with God. And if you can't handle God, you put another O in it, and just fill it with good, and you're fine. You can also fill it with drugs, sex, and rock and roll, and it all works for a while. Bottom line is it wears off, and the hole gets a little bit bigger, and over time it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And what most or many alcoholics addicts who come in to treatment talk about this feeling just totally empty. There's just nothing left. And of course we can pathologize it. We can say that's depression, and that's anxiety, and the symptomatology is there, and sometimes it needs medication, but oftentimes it is about how to fill that hole back up in healthy ways. And so my belief is that, and again, I have no proof that this has all been working in the addiction field for 46 years, is that about a third of the people come are in the middle of what I call an existential angst. They've lost or they never had meaning or purpose. And this was part of my story, is that there was, I got to a certain age, I can remember very young, trying to figure the world out. I've always sort of felt like a stranger in a strange land, that I sort of actually got dumped on this planet by accident. I was supposed to be someplace else, and somehow I ended up here. And so this existential angst, and in terms of my work with individuals, it seems one of those things where most of the people that I've worked with had been in that sort of existential angst, not being able to find meaning, purpose, and in my job helping them develop, figure out what spirituality means to them. And we basically for some people, the hardest part is differentiating religion from spirituality, and understanding that it's much easier to have a religion. If you have a religion, it's written down for you. They give you the rules. You live that way, and for the most part, most of them are not bad. I mean, there may be some issues around your personal value system that wouldn't like a specific religion, but for the most part, they're all trying to do the same thing, trying to be good. And if you do all the right things, you'll go to this wonderful place. Those who don't believe in that process, of religion, then spirituality then becomes their process, and they have to figure that out, what that is. What does spirituality mean? So when people said, well, I don't believe in a deity. And I said, not this, deities have nothing that much to do with spirituality. It is, and to me, the simplest way I've been able to say it is spirituality is your inner journey, and where it takes you. And but it has some prerequisites. That means there has to be a commitment to it. You can do smorgasbord if you want, but I've found that for most people, they have to pick something, a path, whatever that path is for them, and they have to have a commitment to it. And the development of faith in the process. Now, faith in what? When I first started out, it was faith in faith, and it was sort of like and very 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 primal way. What does that mean? Well, I know for the most part that if I come into a room and I look at the light switch, I flick it on, pretty much have faith that the light's going to go on. And if it doesn't, I usually can figure out what to do so it will. Change a light bulb, get an electrician, etc. Now, I don't know what electricity is or where it comes from. Well, that's not true. In the spirituality I follow, it comes from the thunder beings. They have that power, and there's an issue with the thunder beings when they come. But if we have time, we can maybe talk about that. So, that's sort of been my journey, and it still is. The broader spirituality that I've sort of became involved in is Lakota. I'm a pipe carrier and have been a sun dancer in the Lakota tradition, and and follow the basic tenets of the Lakota way, which are not that different than most spiritual paths in terms of those things, going to sweats and being part of the community. And I'm an elder now, whatever that means. I have a joke about the difference between an elder and an old person. So, I'm going to be 75 at my next birthday. So it's sort of like, am I just an old person? And in most traditions, when someone gets old, they're considered wise. I'm not too sure I have that, but I do. One of my fellow elders said to him, being an elder is when you know your limits, so we joke about that. If nothing else happens, when we're at ceremony, we get fed first, that's sort of been my journey, I do certain ceremonies once a week, and I still meditate, in this time of my life, it's sort of like I'm not really, even though I call myself a seeker, I'm not necessarily seeking anymore. Again, the transition to being old, or as an elder, to what does that all mean, and what do I still have to contribute as someone in my age, in my personal work, when I was at a treatment program, one that you and I both know, there was a transition in the program, and they wanted to keep me, but because I'm not licensed, I'm not an MFT or an LCSW or a PhD, they needed to find a place for me. And so they made me the director of something. I can't remember the word. They want to call me the spiritual director, and that just felt too weird. So they gave me another label, etc. But my job basically was to work with people about spirituality. And again, I had everything from people coming in saying, but I remember this one person came to me and said, I don't know why I need to see you. I'm a Christian. And I said, well, great. That's good. And I asked him, I said, do you have a personal relationship with what you call God? And he stopped and he says, what do you mean by that? I said, well, especially in your Christian tradition, it is about a personal relationship that you've developed. And he stopped. And he said, well, I go to church, I pray. I said, no, that's not what I'm asking. Do you have a personal relationship? And for whatever reason, that sort of like blew a big hole in his whole spirit or his whole religious beliefs, because he realized he didn't. And that was sort of this hole. And I said, well, that's part of your journey now, is to find that personal relationship. Other people come in and, they're angry, I'm an atheist, leave me alone. And I said, atheists can be spiritual. I mean, Buddhists don't believe in a deity. I mean, that's what most people wrangle about, is, this idea that there's a deity up there someplace, and that's pulling the strings and, judging you and, all the other stuff. Mainly in, again, in our society, because of the Judeo-Christian ethic that's there, that's woven into not just religion, but in just basically how most of us are taught to believe at some level, and in terms of the values, etc. So it's working with them around these issues around, what is it that you don't believe in, and then I ask them, what do you do believe in? And then we work from that, from there. And so if nothing else, they walk away with a perspective that is, they have a different perspective on what spirituality is. And if they choose to, follow that, and many have, and one of the ways that I sort of helped them with this was I had been looking for sort of an assessment around spirituality, but almost all of them had a religious overtone of some kind. And then I ran into something called, one of the consultants that was working at the treatment program told me about this thing called SQ21. And it was an assessment that had no necessarily religious overtones to it, but would assess this idea of, give you an idea of what spirituality was and where you are on, lack of a better word, a continuum. And if we have time, I'll give a quick story about how this happened. The woman who started this is a woman named Cindy Wigglesworth. I love the name. And she started off, got her BA, I guess, in something. But anyway, she went to work in HR, human resources at Chevron. And she did really well, she thought. And then when she got her evaluations, they were saying something like, your work is impeccable, but no one likes you. And someone said, well, okay. But then she realized that, this was a theme. She wasn't going anywhere because even though her work was great, so she decided to say, okay, maybe I need to fix this. So she went to a therapist who realized she had zero EQ, no emotional intelligence at all. And so she went on a quest. She taught herself how to have an emotional IQ. And from that point, she then became a lot more, her evaluations were, gee, you do great work, it's impeccable, and people like you. So, so that changed her life in terms of this whole thing. And she, really felt it was really pretty good. I don't know exactly why the next step happened, but what happened was I think she ended up with a Jungian psychologist. And if you're going to, be with a Jungian psychologist, at some point they're going to talk about spirituality. And she said, "What's that?" It was sort of like, it wasn't she was against it, but her background, her family background, there was no, she was brought up as an atheist, didn't even see herself as an atheist. She just was, it was just something she didn't know. And she thought to herself, if I was able to teach myself how to become emotionally, have emotional IQ, can I teach myself to do the spiritual thing? And so she used that same model and went out into her quest was to find what it is to be spiritual, or have a spiritual intelligence. And she basically, I think, if I know right, she basically cashed out. She had now become, I think, a senior vice president at Chevron. She cashed out and devoted her life to finding this idea of what this is. And she came up with this idea of an assessment, just like you can take an assessment in emotional intelligence. She came up with this assessment. It's very sophisticated, and there are, I think you have to, I got certified in it, and you take the assessment. They're very quickly. What I do is, if someone wants to take it, I order it for them, and then go over it, because it can look really. If you don't have someone who really knows what's going on with it and what the answers really mean, and suggestions for spiritual growth, then it can actually, in my belief, can be harmful, because you can, it may have ideas that you're not spiritual at all, and you're this or that, etc., which is not what's intended and needs interpretation. Anyway, I didn't say that quite eloquently, but that's
we get it. Yeah, it should be interpreted by someone who's trained in this instrument, basically.
Thank you. Yeah. And so that's what I do. And then what it does is, for areas that if you choose to want to increase your knowledge or your ability or your skill, it gives it suggestions in terms of each area to do that. So it just gave people a direction in terms of, if they didn't have a religion, they didn't really understand the idea of spirituality, they didn't want to join a Buddhist group or whatever, this would give them a little bit of a roadmap to what to do next. And so I've given it to dozens of people, both at the treatment program I've worked in, and then when I was doing my private practice, specifically working with people who were high relapsers. They've not been able to it's sort of my specialty, working with people with relapse. And oftentimes it's because of this spiritual void that they have. They can't seem to find any kind of meaning. So if there's no meaning, why not just stay loaded, so the other part, in terms of the broader brush of things. So in the Native American community, we talk about a lot of what's happened to Native Americans and pretty much any person of color that lives in the United States, and other places too. But from the Native American perspective, we have something that we call cultural trauma, and part of when we're talking about meaning and purpose, we had a population who lived here, and when we talk about Native American, it's sort of like saying European. They're European. Well, okay, that talks about sort of a population that lives in an area of the world called European, but there's a big difference between a German and a Frenchman. Their language, their belief systems, etc. Same thing with the Native American community, in that there's a real big difference between how a Lakota practices their spirituality versus how the Dene or what we call Navajo practice their. In fact, the Navajo spirituality is much more like the Tibetan Buddhism, in terms they use sand paintings, they do a variety of similar kinds of things to each other. The point I'm making here is that there's different spirituality in language and same thing that we'd find in any continent with a different population. But one thing is consistent is that every Native American population in the United States, and I could say Canada and Mexico and South America and Central America, has experienced the same thing, and that's cultural trauma. That the European contact that came here tried to demolish the Native American period, either through just genocide and then cultural genocide. And so most Native Americans, or many Native Americans that I've worked with, one of the bigger issues is they don't know who they are. They can say that I'm a Lakota or a Dene, et cetera, but they don't know what that means. They don't know their language. They don't know what it is to be a Lakota man or woman, or Dene man or woman. And that puts this big hole inside. And, the suicide rates among Native people are twice as high as the general population. So what that means, the medicine man that I follow, work with, his name is Richard Mooskamp. He's a traditional Lakota medicine man. And one of his life has been devoted to bringing back the ceremonies and the belief systems of the Lakota people, and anyone that wants to be involved. So he doesn't, if you're earnest and you're not Native, it's not a problem. But anyway, so his family lineage, if people know about what happened to Native Americans in, I think it was about 1876 or so, Native Americans were no longer allowed to practice their religion. And one of the fundamental rights for people in the United States, they were denied that right. So they went underground, or many people went underground for 100 years. And it wasn't until 1976 where the Native American Religious Freedom Act came into being, where they could openly, do that. Then there was Wounded Knee, and then there was, all the other stuff that went along with it. But the point is that Richard has promoted the Native language, the values of what Native people have, and he was one of the people who brought back the Sundance, which is a very specific Native ceremony, and with the idea that many of the people that I danced with or know, when I go back to ceremony, that's how they got sober, was through coming back to the Native traditions, going to sweats, having there's a ceremony that I know the Dene people have, the ceremony, and the Lakota people have, when a lot of the people, the warrior tradition, come back from war, they have healing ceremonies for these guys, and to bring their spirit back, and from trauma that they experienced in war. When people pass away, they have something called wiping of the tears, which is another ceremony to help the healing process of grief. So there are many people who are getting clean and sober through their, coming back to their traditions, or adopting those traditions for themselves in their spiritual quest. one last story, and then we can decide where we want to go from there. I was doing a training on how to work with Native people. I used to do a lot of training for an organization called California Rural Indian Health Board, and another one called American Indian Training Institute. And so I was up in Redding at one of the casinos, one of the tribes there who owned one of the casinos, and we're actually in the casino in one of the rooms, and I had I don't know, half a dozen counselors who worked with Native people, and I won't go into that whole story, but it was people had a lot of issues around accepting the cultural trauma that has happened to Native people. You know, well, they got a casino, and I won't get into that one either, because that's another story. Anyway, so I was sitting there, and a woman came in who worked there, and she was said, you know, can I listen in? And I said, sure, yeah, come on in. So she's sitting there, and there was a little bit of a heated discussion between me and this one individual who had an issue around some things I was saying. And she said, can I say something? And I said, sure. You know, she says, you know, I'm in recovery. And so let me tell you quickly about my journey. I was sent to Friendship House. Friendship House is a Native American treatment program in San Francisco. It's been there for a long time, and who, you know, specifically works with Native Americans, and that, you know, the studies show in terms of treatment that the more culturally relative a treatment program is, the higher levels of success. So whether it's Native American or Latino or African American, you know, it doesn't make a difference. If it's more culturally relevant to them, then, you know, there's a better outcome. So she says, I went through that program, and she said, for the first time, she says, I'm a Pit River Indian and some other tribe, I can't remember, California Native. So I came back, you know, and the treatment experience was wonderful. I you know, I got to do sweats, and I sort of became proud of being a Native woman and kind of stuff. But I relapsed, and I went back to Friendship House. And she says, I have an aunt who is a traditional Pit River woman that I really didn't have a lot of contact with. She was, I think, her mother's sister or something like that. So when I came back and sort of like, oh, you know, how am I going to do this kind of thing? She contacted me, and she said, something to the effect, do you want to know what it is to be a Pit River woman? And she said, well, what does that mean? She says, well, if you're interested, I will help you become a Pit River woman. And she says, that's when my recovery started, because I had no idea what that meant. I wasn't too sure, she said, what a woman was. So I now follow the traditions of the Pit River people and their beliefs, etc. And that's when my recovery got solidified. I now know who I am, and I have a path to follow that supports my recovery. And she doesn't go to AA or NA or any of those things. This is her way. And so this is, you know, there's a organization called White Bison. I just saw that Don Coyas, who started it, just had a birthday, and he's got long-term recovery. He's actually, I guess I could break his anonymity, I don't know. Anyway, he's got long-term recovery. But he also started an organization. Now, I'm going to tell a story here, but keep it as third hand, okay? So this is what I understand how White Bison got started. So Don Coyas is a Mohawk Indian, but he, and they're from, you know, New York area, but he ended up in New York City, and he worked on Madison Avenue. He worked in advertising, et cetera. You know, three-piece suit, you know, et cetera, short hair, he got into recovery and etc. And then, but he'd always stayed a little bit close to his Mohawk belief systems, right? So the story, as I've heard, is that the elders called him and said, we had a vision. You need to quit your job and start something that's going to help the people who have addiction and trauma. So he said, I guess I better do this. And that's how this started, called the Red Road. So Don wrote the book and started a publishing company, and then ended up being training and started a whole movement called the Red Road, which took things like the 12 steps and put it in the medicine wheel, and do just a variety of things that I've used with non-Native people to explain addiction at a different level. Why their recovery sometimes is not working for them, and so but yeah, it's called Wellbriety is the name of the book, and there's other books too. So so other things you want to ask about? I've just sort of been babbling on here for the last half hour or whatever.
No. It's been wonderful. You've actually been answering so many of the questions that I have, and I love all the resources you're giving us. We'll be sure to add those in the show notes so people can find all these wonderful resources you're telling us about. I guess, when I'm working with people, in addiction and in rehab and stuff, it is really spirituality. It's like this vague kind of question mark. What is it? Is it? And so many people do see it as this external, like I'm supposed to be connected, like you said, to an external deity of some sort. But really, it has to start from within, right? I mean, and the soul retrieval kind of process always strikes me. It's like reconnecting with our own soul, which we get very disconnected from, particularly with trauma. And I guess I'm wondering, can you say more about these practices that you're doing and inviting people to that allow them to reconnect with themselves and to reclaim those parts and pieces of themselves that they may have lost contact with through abuse, trauma, life in general here, stranger in a strange land, all those things?
Well, there's a couple of things that I do. So one of the things, like for instance, like anything in our world, we have to have someone who gives us permission to do things. So for instance, you got a PhD. There were people that gave you permission to do that. If you showed them that you were able to, quote unquote, have a PhD, and you passed whatever tests you are. So for instance, I'm not allowed to do sweats. Not that I'm not allowed. I can't perform sweats. I've not been given permission to, mainly because I can never learn the songs and sing them on my own. I always have to have someone else singing with me. But the medicine man did say, he says, you can take some of what you have learned and work with. He would what do you call it, with chachas, anyway, with white folk, if you think it would help them. So I've been allowed to do pipe ceremonies with clients. So I've been allowed to build my own altar and perform this pipe ceremony. And how I perform a pipe ceremony is that so the concept of the quote unquote the peace pipe. The idea of filling the pipe, and there's nothing that goes in the pipe that's going to get you high. In fact, it would be sort of not a sin, but it would be an error to do so. So the only thing that goes in there is basically red willow bark and tobacco. Before tobacco came to, or that Native people used it in the Midwest, it was basically a mixture of other things that it didn't even have tobacco in it. Anyway, the idea that the tobacco, when you're putting the tobacco in the pipe, there's prayers that go to it. Or if people have a problem with that word, I say, whatever your intentions are. So I have them make an intention for their recovery. And I said, before we do this, if we do this ceremony, you have to be really clear about what you're going to do with this intention. It means there has to be follow through. You have to be willing to do the things that we've talked about and the intention. So we put the tobacco in there in the intention. I often have them do something called prayer ties, which are little bundles of a little piece of cloth, an inch, 2-inch by 2-inch kind of thing. You put a little tobacco in there, again with the same thing, with an intention or prayer, and do 7 of them, and then we do the ceremony. And so it sets what's going to follow. They don't have to tell me what the intention is if they don't want to. I've also done that as a rites of passage. So many of us, I was one of them, that I talk about the 5-15 rule. And the point is, quickly, is that when someone crosses over from a non-alcoholic to an alcoholic or an addict, your developmental process stops. And so early onset alcoholics, addicts, for instance, I was alcoholic by the time I was 15 years old. So developmentally, when I got sober, I was 15 years old. And I was still in the midst of adolescent projected reasoning, black and white thinking, the world won't let me be, etc., blaming the world for all my circumstances, etc. So and we have very little rites of passage, and I could spend another 2 hours talking about that one. We have very little rites of passage for men. I joke about it, it's not funny actually, that the average teenager thinks he's a man the first time he has sex other than with himself, the first time he gets his driver's license, and the first time he gets loaded. Now I'm a man, and we're wondering why men can't show up. So I do a rites of passage with this, and I say, if we smoke this pipe, then you have to be willing to take on the responsibilities of what a man is. And they'll look at me, and I says, okay, I will give you what those are, and what your responsibilities are. And so I make it a ceremony for them to move to from adolescence to manhood, and they have to be willing to take on it. So in a counseling situation, or when I meet with people, I don't usually like to call it counseling, but when we meet, and I see adolescent, thinking comes out, I say, can't do it. You're a man now. So what does a man do in terms of the situation? And we also talk about what a warrior is. When I'm working with Native people, a warrior is not someone who goes out and beats someone up, or is strong, etc. What a warrior is, he serves and protects his family and his tribe. That's what a warrior is. He's willing to give his life for them. Same thing with machismo. It's not that I'm the man. It's really taken from the warrior tradition, is that your job is to serve and protect your family and your tribe or your community, whatever that is. So I use the pipe in terms of that process to help them either set their intention about what the recovery is all about, and then we move forward from there, or have them become an adult.
Yeah, I think we've really moved away from in American Western cultures in particular, we've moved away from these traditional rituals, like you said, rites of passage, rituals of various sorts. And I've often thought that this what's cropped up around drugs and alcohol is this like pseudo ritual, right? Like literally the preparing of a different kind of pipe, or to prepare something to inject, you go through this whole little ritual around it. And
Mhm.
I wonder how much of that is sort of unconsciously an attempt to because I do think a lot of people through drugs and alcohol are seeking, they are looking for some sort of meaning and purpose, and then saying, well, if I can't find it here, maybe I'm going to find it in some other dimension, reality,
Mhm.
whatever. um
Well, also, oh, go ahead.
no, and then, and it gets a little confusing, I think, with now we have the whole psychedelic, resurgence, and we know that even in some of the traditional cultures, there's been the peyote, the ayahuasca, people, the medicine man or the shaman has used and those substances to get information and connection with other elders, spirits, whatever. So
Mhm.
um, I think it's been sort of confusing for people.
Yeah, again, thanks for reminding me of this. I also have had the honor of participating in the Native American Church, and which is basically the use of peyote to hook up with what they would call God. And I know lots of individuals again who have found recovery um, uh, through that process. I remember this one not young man, a really interesting guy. He says, everyone in my family were alcoholics. They have all died from alcoholism. He says, when I was 15 years old, I was a full-blown alcoholic living in the streets. Basically, family was disconnected, etc. I'm not sure how he got connected with the Native American Church, but he did. And his experience through that was, his connection with a power greater than himself, but also that what they call the roadman, the guy who uh, uh, runs the ceremony, the American ceremony, which is very complex and different from other Native traditions. And this one guy that I know, he's about, he's a couple of years older than me, but then mentored this young man. He says, after a while, this guy said, he says, okay, now it's time to go back to school. He said, I will go back to, you go back to school. You're going back to school. And so he mentored him getting back to school, how to become a man. And 30 years later, here he is, he has married, his children, he has a job, he has, all the normal things, and still participates in the Native American Church. And I've known lots of people who've found their recovery specifically through there, or in addition to. In other words, they may start off with 12 steps or something like that, and found the American Church. My concern about this is, like anything else, it took me a long time to find a real medicine man. My own arrogance is always sort of like, I can do that crap. So to find someone who's really authentic, because there's a lot of guys, because they can speak the language, sing a couple of songs, they sort of purport themselves to be that and can do some damage or have done some damage. Or what was it, 10 years ago, the guy that built, was charging people a couple of $1,000s to come to his weekend, and they'd have this sweat, and he built this huge sweat, but he did it with PVC pipe, and built this fire in there, and the heat got to it, and people died from the fumes from the PVC pipe because he didn't know what he was doing. So it took me a long time to find the real thing. And we're seeing this, with the emergence of using psychedelics, and I believe there's some value in this, but it needs to be done. I know there are people who are therapists who, underground now, who will take someone and take them for a weekend and help them through, whether it's using ayahuasca or psilocybin or peyote, to help them move through some trauma or move through whatever through that experience. My concern is that it needs to have someone who really knows what they're doing, there's a difference between going out and doing a lot of shrooms, just see like, oh, cool, as opposed to use it as a spiritual process. I think it's important to know that you have someone that knows what they're doing and can help, lack of a better word, interpret what's going on for you.
Yes. It's all about the set and setting, as they say, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Ben, this has been such a rich conversation. I could go on for another hour with you.
Yeah.
You're such a wealth of wisdom, and I think you've just highlighted so many key things. I mean, I think just giving a great explanation of spirituality, its importance for addiction recovery, trauma work, the community piece, connection, right? I always think of spirituality as connection with self, with others, with something greater. And you've really, I think, illustrated that so well, the importance of finding a place and people that you can feel connected with. Because I think one of the big issues with people with addictions is they're so cut off and they feel so alone, right? And I think that contributes to the suicidality, the depression, the soul loss, all of it. So really, you've shown us that there are ways, many, many ways to reconnect with self, reclaim soul, and explore. Like you said, it's a journey of exploration, explore in this context of ritual and practices. And a lot of it I know has to do with the earth as well, right? Like really vision quests and being out in nature and things like that. Many of the practices are done outside, and the role of earth and our stewardship of it. I know that's a big piece as well. There's just so much more for people to explore. If people want to find out more, and we'll definitely put links in, like I said, the show notes. If people want to find out more about you or would like to work with you, how can they do that?
Simple. You can put my email address. I over the years I sort of took down all my websites, etc., that I had years ago. So it's simple. Send me a email at owlspeak@.com or at hotmail.com, and I'm on Facebook. So you can probably get a hold of me there, that would be the easiest way to do it.
Thank you so much. And thanks again for sharing your wisdom and experience and your strength and hope and your humility. It's always wonderful to hear you speak and hear about your journey and what a journey it has been. So thank you so much. Super grateful. And thank you all for tuning in. If you have enjoyed this episode of the podcast, please do share, comment, like. Let's get this out there in the hands of more people so that they can know that there are many, many, many ways to view and approach and treat mental illness, addiction. There's so much more to it than what the traditional paradigm has shown us. So thanks everybody for tuning in.
All right, thank you. My honor.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of Kaleidoscope of Possibilities, Alternative Perspectives on Mental Health. This has been Dr. Adriana Popescu. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe and share with others. To find out more about me, my guests, and more, please visit my website at adrianapopescu.org. See you next time.